Hello Year 10 and welcome to your Monday webinar. Now some of you may be looking at me thinking this doesn't feel right. You had a really cool background earlier that had little water molecules, one of them was pouting, and you would be correct, this isn't technically the live link from the webinar. And just to prove that everybody makes mistakes, I completely messed up and didn't bother recording it for some strange reason. So because I went on and on about how much you needed to refer back to the webinar to do the work, here I am re-recording the slides and the explanations so that you have something to refer to. I'm going to try and do it exactly how I did it live to those of you who saw both, but if I do miss anything, please do let me know and I'm happy to sort of fill in some gaps, etc. So today, I'm just going to make myself smaller and go and hide in the corner over here. So today we need to look a little bit more about what we did last week. And last week we focused predominantly on the nervous system and how the nervous system can control certain reactions in our body, how we can respond to certain stimuli, and we linked that into something called the reflex arc, which, if you remember, was a really nice little flow chart that showed you the processes the body goes through before it responds. Now, in terms of feedback from your teachers were really positive about you. They said you had excellent engagement with the tasks themselves and that the most of you did exceptionally well on the quiz, scoring really highly, which is brilliant. It shows that you were focused and that you learnt something within that video. Now, what do we need to work on? Well, the question that was most frequently done incorrectly on the quiz was the question about the effector. Now remember, the effector is either a muscle or a gland or something in the body that can bring about a change. And in this case, when we're talking about, let's say, moving your arm from touching something hot, well, the effector would be the muscle that contracts to pull your arm backwards. Now, the effector is not the response itself. Some of you confused those two things slightly. And secondly, we're going to look at this a bit more today, but looking at the stages in the reflex arc, I can't tell you, Year 10, how frequently that comes up in questions about the nervous system, because it's always the same. Sure, we might be looking at a specific set of receptor cells, and we might be looking at a specific effector and response, but the order in which they come never changes. So, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through two things. We're going to look at synapses, which is the gap between two nerves, and we're going to look at the three types of neuron that we have mentioned in the reflex arc. Finally, we're going to review the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is just the hormonal system. So when you hear the word endocrine, I just want you to think hormones. And we're going to spend more time than just the end of this webinar on that. So please don't feel as though I'm going to rush over it, because it will be quite brief at the end. So this is a lesson, so let's start with some do now tasks. As this is a video, I'm able to ask you to pause afterwards. So these three questions I'd like you to have a go at. If you've got some scrap paper, or if you've just got some time to think about the answers, I'd like you to do that. The first question, what is the definition of homeostasis? Second question, give three things that need to be kept in balance in your body. And the third question, why is it vital that these things are balanced? Now, before you attempt these questions, I want to give you a reminder. Biology is about, well, it's about the study of living things, but in terms of doing well in biology, it's about using specific terminology. The more accurate you are with the words that you use, the better your results are going to be. Be careful about describing things too loosely. If you use what I would call colloquial language, so language that you would use just in everyday speech, sometimes that makes your answer seem a little bit too basic. So really think about those higher level words that we're going to need. What I'd like to do now is to pause this video and have a go at these three questions. We'll look at the answers when you come back. So, the answers to those questions, and I want you to pay particular attention to those key words. The first question, what is the definition of homeostasis? Homeostasis is the regulation of internal conditions within a cell or an organism to maintain an optimum environment to function. What does that mean? Well, it means keeping things balanced in your body so that everything runs just right. Now, this word optimum, I like to think of Goldilocks when I think of optimum. She didn't want to eat the porridge that was too hot, or didn't want to eat the porridge that was too cold. She went for the one that was just right. And in science, like I said about biology, we have to be specific. We're not going to say things like just right. The word optimum is what we would use there. What are the conditions in which the body is going to work its best? The regulation of internal conditions, just keeping things balanced. Now, 3 things that need to be kept in balance in your body. You could have had far more than these 3 that I have on the slide here, but these are the ones we went through in the last webinar, so they're the ones that I've decided to use again. Blood glucose concentration is 1. Remember, blood glucose is just blood sugar. Number 2 is your body temperature. And number 3 is the amount of water there is in your blood. And it's really important that all of those 3 things are kept balanced. And one of the main reasons that we need to keep things balanced in your body is so that enzymes can work properly. Enzymes are chemicals in every body that enable chemical reactions to take place properly. They allow chemical reactions to take place faster, which means they work better at body temperature and in your body conditions. Without your enzymes working properly at their optimum level, then certain chemical reactions in your body are not going to take place. And that can eventually lead to things like organ failure, which is why it's so important that homeostasis happens in your body at all times. So that's our do now. That's our review on last lesson's work. Let's push forward into what we're going to do today. So part 1, we're going to look at neurons and synapses. So last time, I showed you a couple of diagrams that illustrated the way in which the body processes information from the environment around it and makes a decision about what action to take. And here was one of the diagrams I showed you. So here we have a stimulus. And remember, the word stimulus means change in the environment. And the stimulus here is a pin. It's something sharp. And the part of the body that detects that change, no matter where it is known as a receptor. And in this case, the receptors are found within the skin. They're found in the hand, because that's the part of the body that's being pricked by the nail. And those receptors are pain receptors. Now, the receptors convert that information into a nervous impulse. And that travels along the first neuron in our system. And that is the sensory neuron. I like to remember it because you sense it in your skin, and then the first neuron is your sensory neuron. And that neuron takes that nervous impulse through the nervous system to the central nervous system. And the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. Both of those 3 things together are called your central nervous system. Now, within your central nervous system, which we got a cross-section of your spinal cord here, you can see that there are 2 options. If a decision requires conscious thought, then that impulse is relayed to the brain. And then the brain processes it. Now, that actually happens really quickly too, but the delay can sometimes be really harmful. And if you think about it, guys, things that you react instantly to are things that you do to survive. So if you feel pain, you jump back. If you touch something too hot, too cold, then you instinctively remove your hand from it. And the reason you're able to act that quickly is because instead of that information being processed through the brain, in a reflex arc, that information is processed by the relay neuron. And that's this shorter, far more simple neuron here. That information is transmitted across, finally, to your motor neuron. And the motor neuron takes that nervous impulse from the central nervous system to the effector. And in this case, the effector is a muscle. Here it's the bicep, which is contracting to move the arm upwards away from the source of pain. Now, those 3 neurons are things we need to look at in a little bit more detail. And in order to make it more simple for you to understand, last time we looked at this looked at this flowchart. And we had stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, the central nervous system, be that the brain or the relay neuron, the motor neuron, the effector, and then we see a response. Now today what we're going to look at in more detail are the neurons themselves, sensory, relay, and motor, but also the gaps between them. And I know it seems strange that we're going to focus on a gap between 2 things, but the gap between 2 neurons is known as a synapse. And it's really, really important that we understand the science of it. And I'll explain a little bit more about that a little bit later. So let's go through and look at these. Now, on the screen, you can see 3 different images of the 3 different neurons that we've talked about in this webinar. Each of them have some very specific differences, but they also have some key things in common. Now, the specification says that you need to know about the different types, so know that there are 3 main types of neuron that we talk about, and how they're adapted to their function. And most of that is about the things they have in common. So let's look at the structure of the nerve cell. Well, first of all, you can see that each have a nucleus, and that nucleus is slightly differently placed in each of them, but they need a nucleus because remember, the nucleus contains the genetic information of that cell, which is vital for it to fulfill its function. The backbone of the cell, and it's not a bone to be very, very clear, but the central structure of the cell is this long section here that the nervous impulse travels down. And this is called the axon. And the axon, I like to compare to a wire in a computer or in any electrical appliance. The axon is the part of the cell where the electrical impulse travels down, just like in a wire, the electricity travels down that. And the axons are long, and they're long because they have to stretch across the whole body. Yes, you do have more than one nerve cell that runs from your skin to your brain, but they have to be long because they have a large distance to cover. They also are insulated. So just like a wire, where you want to maintain the integrity of the signal you've got within it, you insulate that with rubber or plastic. Well, in our cells, in our nerve cells, in our neurons, that insulation is called the myelin sheath. And it's a fatty substance that covers the outside of the axon to make sure that that nervous impulse passes through the cell without interference, and so you don't lose some of that signal elsewhere. That's the first thing that they have in common. The second thing is that each of the 3 neurons we've looked at have something called dendrites. Now, dendrites and dendrons are these tiny little branches at the end of the cell. And these split into smaller and smaller branches. And they do that because at the end of every single dendrite is an axon terminal. And that is where you find a synapse. It's where one cell joins to another. And that means that that impulse can be transmitted throughout the whole body. So the 2 things that you will need to be able to describe for your exam and to fulfill this part of the specification are the idea that the cells all have the axon that is insulated by the myelin sheath, and that at either end they have got dendrites which spread and connect to other nerve cells, other neurons. Now there are differences. And in the exam, the way in which I would expect that to be presented, and I can never be 100% sure, but is giving you an image of the cell and asking you to describe it. Now these 2 things that I've just gone through are always things you can talk about all 3, about how they're adapted to fulfill their function. But you could look at the specific ones and think of other things too. For example, in your sensory neuron, the axon itself actually runs through the receptor cell, so it's connected to the receptor cell. And in your motor neuron, rather than having the axon terminals at the end here, it's actually directly connected to the effector so that it can trigger the response. And those are specific for those two neurons. Now the next thing we need to look at is what happens at the end of these dendrites. What happens when one nerve needs to connect to another? And this image here is an image to show what that looks like. Here you've got your first nerve, and here you've got your second nerve. And the electrical impulse will need to travel down this first nerve, this first neuron. It will need to pass over this gap and then travel up the second neuron. But it can't jump. It hasn't got legs to walk across the gap. So how does that happen? Well, on the next slide, I'm going to talk you through it. But before I get to the next slide, it's going to look quite complicated. But I am going to return to this image in a little bit to really, really narrow down what you need to know. So, before I go on to the really specific diagram, let me show you in general what we're talking about. So we have two nerves here, and you can see the bit in which they meet is known as the synapse. The gap between the two neurons is your synapse. And we can use some slightly fancier terminology to describe the nerves that we see here. You have a presynaptic nerve, so presynaptic before the synapse, and you have the postsynaptic nerve, post the synapse, after the synapse. And the impulse is going to move down the presynaptic nerve until it reaches the synapse. Something is going to happen there, and then a new nervous impulse is going to be stimulated down this postsynaptic nerve. So what's happening? Well, what we need to do is figure out how we can get the information across this gap. So the diagram I've got here in front of you, please don't look at it instantly and think, oh my god, that's so confusing. It is a bit confusing, but you don't need to know everything on here. So just listen to what I'll take you through. So this time, it's slightly twisted to the image that we had before. This is one nerve, this is the end of one nerve, and this is the beginning of your second nerve here. So this is the gap in this space here, and we would call that your synapse. Now, the impulse is going to travel along to the end of the nerve, and it's going to reach something called the axon terminal, which is what we call this bit here. Okay, if you think the axon is the long sort of backbone of your cell, terminal is like the end of a train line. So Victoria is a terminal, Brighton is a terminal because it's the end of the train line. So you get to your axon terminal, and there you find these little bubbles. Now these little bubbles are actually little containers, if you like. Containers is probably not the best word, but it's where a chemical is held. And these are called vesicles. And in these vesicles are little tiny chemicals known as neurotransmitters. And these chemicals are released when the impulse moves through to the axon terminal. Once they're released, they diffuse across the synapse itself, because we know that diffusion happens when the concentration in one area is higher than in another, and they will diffuse towards the lower concentration, which would be the other nerve. And on the second nerve, the postsynaptic nerve, you find these receptors, and you also find little ion channels. Now, once these receptors detect the neurotransmitter and the specific neurotransmitters that have been released, they stimulate a new nervous impulse that's then going to carry on down this postsynaptic nerve. Let's be clear now. There's only 4 things you need to say. So that's the really technical diagram that I do advise you looking at and trying to put through your own words. But let's be specific about what's happening in 4 easy to follow steps. So, at step 1, the nervous impulse is travelling down the presynaptic nerve, or the neuron before the synapse, until it gets to the axon terminal, the end of the neuron. Step 2, neurotransmitters are released, because they're triggered to do so by the impulse, from vesicles. Step 3, the neurotransmitters diffuse across the gap, which is called a synapse. And step 4, the receptors detect the neurotransmitter and stimulate a new nervous impulse. Now you can go back and go through those steps as many times as you need to until you can recall them yourselves. Might I suggest that if you find that a bit complicated, you have a go at a flashcard and keep it to keep referring to, or pop it on a poster where you can see it really frequently. I'm going to summarise that again very, very simply this time. Number 1, nerve impulse reaches the end of the neuron. Number 2, neurotransmitters are released from vesicles. Number 3, neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse to the next neuron. Number 4, the receptors detect the neurotransmitter and stimulate a new nervous impulse. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a synapse. A synapse is the gap between two nerves, but it's not that simple. A synapse allows the nervous impulse to be transmitted between nerves using a chemical called a neurotransmitter. Now that was your first section. If you need to pause and go back and re-watch this bit, then please do. The second thing we're going to look at is the endocrine system. Now, endocrine just relates to hormone. So when you see the word endocrine, think hormone. Now, I'm going to be completely honest, I've always pronounced it endocrine, but I have heard people say endocrine. It doesn't matter to me which way you pronounce it, and if I'm doing it wrong, please do correct me. But the most important thing is that you remember this is your hormones. And we've looked at the nervous system now. We've looked at how your body responds really quickly to changes that it needs to respond to. But what about when you need a longer acting response? When you haven't got enough water in your blood, so you need to make sure that you're not going to urinate too excessively. Well, you don't want that to be a quick, short-lived response, because you might not pee then, but you might need to pee straight after. You want something that's going to have a long-lasting effect, and that it doesn't hurt if it takes a little bit longer to take place. Now let's look first of all at a table here that I want you to look at in your own time, because it really nicely summarises the difference between the two. But here we can see that the hormonal system, the endocrine system, is quite different to the nervous system. So it sends a chemical signal. And what does that mean? Well, guys, it literally is releasing a chemical. It releases a chemical from a gland somewhere in the body. That chemical gets into the bloodstream and it will move to a target organ. And that target organ is what we would have called an effector if we were talking about the nervous signals. And that target organ will then make some sort of change which is going to correct the balance that you need to keep in homeostasis. Now, it happens more slowly than a nervous response, but the important thing is that the duration of the response is much, much longer, and that's why it's really important we have both systems of control. Now, on the screen now, I've got a couple of things I want you to really pay attention to. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is this box here. And if you're writing flashcards or you have started doing your flashcards, I know many people in my class have, that is a really important thing to get on a flashcard about what a gland does. Now, glands are organs found all around the body, and we're going to go through a few in a second. And they secrete hormones. That word secrete is very, very important. They don't just simply release hormones, they produce and release in very specific ways. So what we say instead is secrete. Glands secrete hormones, which travel through the bloodstream to a target organ. A target organ will be different depending on which hormone we're looking at, and I'll go through some of those in a second with you.
Now, there are lots of different types of glands in the body. Some do lots and lots of jobs. One or two have one very specific job. So let's look at a couple in general now. Just to flag that we will be looking at quite a few of these glands and the hormones they produce and the actions that they cause in subsequent webinars. So the first one we're going to look at is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is found within the neck area, and it produces a hormone called thyroxine. And thyroxine is a hormone that's really related to growth. The next gland that we can see on this diagram is the pancreas. And the pancreas is found in the abdomen, and it produces insulin. And I think of all of the hormones we're going to go through, insulin is probably one that you know more about. And insulin is responsible for the regulation, the control, the balance of blood sugar. And we're going to do a whole webinar on that next week. The testes and the ovaries are parts of the male and female reproductive systems separately. The testes produce testosterone, and the ovaries produce estrogen. Testosterone and estrogen do very different jobs, and the testosterone will promote male characteristics, so it's to do with the deepening of the voice. Too much testosterone can lead to increased aggression. It's also responsible for increased growth of hair. Whereas estrogen is involved in the menstrual cycle, and it's involved in the maturation of eggs in ovaries ready to be released. The adrenal glands here are just found very close to the kidneys, again in the abdomen, and they produce a really important hormone called adrenaline. Now, adrenaline, you might have not even realised is a hormone, but it actually is. And the adrenaline is responsible for what we often talk about as the fight or flight mechanism. Adrenaline increases your heart rate, increases your breathing rate, and allows you to do things that you may have not felt you were physically able to before, because it allows you to push your body further, run faster, get slightly stronger. And the reason it does that is because it's a survival mechanism. It's the way in which you respond to fear and to danger. Now, lastly, in the glands I'm going to show you, these are not all of the glands, by the way, but these are the ones we're just going to focus on probably in this module, is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is known as the master gland. And it's located at the base of the brain, and it's very, very small. And it's called the master gland for a couple of reasons. The first reason is it produces lots of different hormones, and because of that, it controls lots of different processes. It also produces hormones that trigger the release of other hormones. So the pituitary gland sort of has an eye on lots of different things that are going on. Now, pituitary glands are fascinating, and for the extension task that I have given you, and I'll go through in a second, you can see that I've given you some additional resources to do a bit of research on the pituitary gland and what can happen if it doesn't function properly. Now, that is pretty much the end of the content I wanted to go through with you. Now, there are two sections that it's really important that you can understand. And I do expect you to be going back in the slideshow and going back in this video to have a little look if you are stuck. You've got part one, which is about the neurons and the synapses, knowing how the neurons are specialised to function, knowing how the things they have in common and the structure of the neuron, and synapses, which is the gap between two nerves, and how an impulse is transmitted across that gap. Section 2 was a very brief introduction to the endocrine system, a comparison with the nervous system, and then a discussion of some of the different types of glands and the hormones they release. Next lesson, we're going to look more in detail at the process of regulation of blood glucose. We're going to look at how insulin causes the body to store blood glucose. We're going to look at the whole negative feedback loop. We're also going to look at what happens when the body isn't able to do that properly. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And that is next week, so we'll talk about it then. But let's look at what I want you to do. So this has been the video, and some of you were in the webinar earlier, which you were there live for. But on Thursday, in your next science session, I would like you to re-watch this video. I'd like you to make sure that you understand the content within it. I'd then like you to have a go at watching the video from Miss Yarvi about synapses, and that will be uploaded directly to your Google Classroom. That video is fantastic because it goes through in far more detail some of the really key terminology about what happens at a synapse. And those of you that are aiming for your grades 7, 8 and 9s really should be trying to incorporate that terminology in your work. Your task for Thursday is to complete the quiz, and that quiz has got quite simple, quite short questions that ask you to recall key terminology and that ask you to label different things. For example, they are all taken from exam questions, and so they are things that you may well be asked to do in your GCSEs. On Friday, what I want you to do is, again, rewatch this webinar if you need to, but also use these slides and additional resources that your teachers may post to complete the longer answer exam questions. And what I'm going to do now is show you those questions. So they should be attached to your Google Classroom, and you'll see that they're in a Google Doc. Now this doc is there for you to edit yourself, so you'll be able to write directly on here. Now the instructions at the front tell you what you need to do. So you need to answer all questions. You need to use the webinar, some slides, and anything else that you might need, BSE Bitesize, freesciencelessons.com, etc., to help you answer it. Now the first 2 questions I've given you are 6 markers. But to make it easier, you are going to have a go at the question, and then you're going to self-mark using the mark scheme. You're then going to improve upon what you've done. The second section, from question 3 onwards, are questions that have no mark scheme provided that your teacher will mark. Now that doesn't mean you need to start on question 3, you need to have a go at the first 2 first. Now there are 25 marks for that section. I'm well aware that that might be too much for you to finish within the 45 minutes allowed time. So do as much as you can in the detail required for each question, and if you need to submit before it's finished, that's absolutely fine. You can always ask for access to it to complete it if you have any additional time after that. Now let's go through just the first question, just so that you can think about how to attempt it. The first question is a 6 marker. It's a really common one. It's one that talks about a required practical that you should have had a go at in lesson and that you will go over again before your actual exams. So it says, 2 students investigated the effect of caffeine concentration on reaction time. This is the method used. Student A drinks a cup of coffee. Student B holds a ruler above student A's hand. Student B drops the ruler. Student A catches the ruler as quickly as she can. The distance the ruler falls is recorded. So your question is to suggest how this method could be improved to produce valid results. Now firstly, look at that word suggest. Suggest suggests to me, and to you hopefully, that there are many possible answers to this question. There are lots of different things that you could say. But the first thing I want you to think about, Year 10, is that this question is about a practical. So the first thing you need to acknowledge is variables. What is the independent variable? What is the thing that they need to change in order to get a result? Have they actually changed it? Because in this question, I don't actually think they have. What would they need to do to produce good results? Do they need to drink more cups of coffee? Do they need to drink different strengths of coffee? How are they going to measure that? The second thing is your dependent variable. Have they talked about what they're going to record in order to get their results? Have they done that in a way which is easy to follow? Have they explained how to do it? Have they included repeats? Have they taken into consideration human error? And lastly, what are the control variables? What are they doing in order to make sure that things are kept the same so that you're only measuring one thing? Also, have they done a control experiment? Have they done a reaction to see what student A's reaction time would have been like if she didn't drink any coffee at all? Because that's really important when you're doing any experiment to have a control. Then think about how those results would have been interpreted. Now it's a 6-mark question. That doesn't always mean you need to write 6 things. In fact, it means you need to write a certain standard of answer. And right enough, if you go to the mark scheme, what you see is a section called indicative content. Now what that means is, this is the content that you could get marks for. These are examples of things that you could say that would give you the marks. And here, you could add to your answer after you've had a go. Remember, you must have a go first. It's going to be much more beneficial to you and how you learn. Second thing you need to look at is the standard at which you answer the question. So if you were getting 2 marks tops, you'd make some discrete relevant points that show some understanding of what is missing from the method, but there's no structure to your answer. You've not really linked those things together or said why. For 4 marks, you've described most of the method and you've got mostly relevant detail in there. It might not be completely logical and there may be some detail missing overall. For 6 marks, you need to outline a coherent method, a method that makes sense, demonstrates that you understand the techniques, but also gives clear improvements, which would mean that you would get valid results, okay, results that are going to be reliable and repeatable. Now you also underneath here have a second question that involves a mark scheme. And I'm going to read through it with you because I think some of you will be shocked when you read it and not know what to do, but actually it's quite simple. So question 2 says, whilst observing mouse behaviour, a student drops a pen near the mouse's cage. The mouse jumps at the noise. Describe as fully as you can the processes by which the mouse responds to the stimulus of the dropped pen. Ladies and gents, what I want you to do here is to use that flowchart and be specific regarding this situation. So rather than simply saying, first there is a stimulus, what is the stimulus? Then what happens? How does the body detect it? Okay, really be specific and you will get 6 out of 6. It is not a difficult question if you have that information ready to go. Like I said, afterwards you have got some slightly shorter questions, but a real range of questions here, all about the stuff that we've done in the last 2 webinars, that is worth about 25 marks that you may not finish, but it's important to have a really good go of it. This should be done on Friday, but if you finish your quiz earlier, you may want to have a go at it first. So, that is the end of our webinar. Now, if you manage to get all of those things done, there is an extension task here which has got some links. What I want you to do is to tell me why the pituitary gland is known as a master gland, and you can do that through these links here and this video, but there are a number of other resources out there that you could use as a resource. If you do that extension task, your teachers will be giving you plenty of achievement points, and I would assume they'd like you to email that to them. Thank you Year 10 for bearing with me whilst I re-recorded my webinar, and as always, make sure that you keep in contact with us and that if you need anything at all, you let us know. Have a good week.